Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us at this webinar on fiscal stimulus options for infrastructure spending. So my name is Frank Jotzo. I'm a professor here at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU, and with me, well, in different locations, are my collaborators and co-authors, Tom Longden, Dr. Thomas Longden, who is a fellow here at ANU and works in research under the Grand Challenge Zero Carbon Asia in the Pacific program, as well as here with us at Crawford School, and Ms. Ziba Anjum, who's a PhD student with us here at Crawford School, and she currently joins us from India, where she got stuck with her family according to the lockdown. So we will be sharing today's presentation as well as the question and answer session. So to begin with, as always, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands that we're meeting on. Right here in Canberra, we're on Ngunnawal land, and of course we pay our respects to the Ngunnawal people's elders, past, present, and the emerging leaders as well. So I would encourage you throughout to please use the Q&A window as well as the chat. Okay, so we've organized this as a webinar, which slightly confines the amount of feedback and interaction that we can have, but that's the way it is now. We do have the opportunity to give the floor to you, including through video interventions through the Q&A, and please just flag that you'd like the floor or you want to ask a question, and we will certainly do that. We will also make sure to have plenty of time for discussion. We'll do this presentation that we've prepared really quite quickly. So let me go through the basics of what we released there into the public domain on Friday of last week. So what it really is, it's an expression of, you know, an obvious new emphasis on our work that we do here at the Center for Climate and Energy Policy at Crawford, and that is taking into account you know, the pandemic and of course, the inevitable response to the economic recession that has come about as a result of COVID and the response measures to COVID. And, you know, I mean, a lot of thinking about environmental policy in general, but specifically the low carbon transition are now framed in terms of, you know, the economic recovery from this rather overwhelming event. And so really, one of the first pieces of work that we're doing in that regard is simply a stock take of how you can think about fiscal stimulus for low carbon compatible COVID-19 responses, and in particular looking at criteria that could be applied to the selection of infrastructure investments. So I'd very much encourage you, you're here, you obviously have an interest, please do look at the paper. There's an enormous amount of detail in that paper, which is available on CCEP Crawford website. So at the heart of this, you know, we're identifying some principles here for deciding public spending on infrastructure. And there's really no surprises here, right? This is basically, you know, some principles for good policy making and for the sound spending of public funding. And so what we're saying is there needs to be clarity about objectives. There needs to be systematic analysis of the different options. There needs to be transparency about that analysis, and there needs to be transparency about the investment decisions taken. After all, this is public money that's being spent, and these decisions right now in the recession stimulus, as they should be, are taken relatively quickly, and so there needs to be you know, the reassurance, including in public communication, that the objectives are clear and what the analysis actually says about the likely achievement of those objectives. Okay, we also say that in deciding infrastructure stimulus, there should be a clear eye to the longer-term public benefit, okay? Jobs, and that's certainly the emphasis of just about any government engaging in this kind of activity now, but also long-term economic benefit, right? Productivity improvements, okay? Positioning the economy for the future, whether that be in terms of the low carbon transition or in other ways. And harnessing the opportunity for social benefits, desirable social and societal outcomes, including local environmental benefits, right? So that's what sound policy making and communication around fiscal stimulus would look like. A related question to that is, of course, the respective role of treasuries, so federal as well as state, the Prime Minister's office, and the various department of Premier and Cabinet at the state and territory level. These are the agencies, right? Assessment agencies, including, in particular in Australia's case, a very particular authority that exists, which is called Infrastructure Australia, and which, as a matter of course, maintains an infrastructure priority list, which we refer to quite extensively in the work that we've done for this report. So briefly, objectives of stimulant spending for infrastructure. Well, you know, I mean, this is to a fair extent a normative question, but quite obviously, as I already mentioned, jobs, longer term economic benefits, social benefits, you know, most everyone would probably agree on these. And then it's really, I mean, there's a really big discourse, including in the European Union, in parts of the American spectrum. We see that reflected in East Asia as well. And that discourse is about the opportunity that COVID infrastructure spending provides in accelerating the shift towards a low carbon economy, right? So we're dealing here with some very long-lived investments that are being put in place that creates risks of locking into high carbon infrastructures, as well as opportunities in getting low carbon infrastructure deployed perhaps more quickly than would otherwise be the case. So federal government announced this week an infrastructure investment package. It has a nice name. It's like, what is it, Job Builder or something like that, right? It speaks of fast tracking applications and fast tracking approval processes for major projects in particular. There's a separate debate around that that's emerging. We won't go into that too much. The announced projects under that program include the Inland Rail between Melbourne and Brisbane, the Mariners Link, the electricity link to Tassie, duplicating the existing one, expansion of the Olympic Dam mine, and then a few road, rail, iron ore projects in WA, and then a number of smaller projects, many of which, to our knowledge, have not been defined yet. And of course, this list can be evaluated according to the different criteria. So what we've done on the basis of very extensive review, assessment, and synthesis is define 9 criteria for stimulus spending in infrastructure. And they are obviously employment, secondly, economic activity and growth into the future. So such things as productivity improvements, prospects for investments to be used productively in the future. The timeliness, of course, and so, you know, as you're getting into very large scale and complicated, complex projects, you may not actually have much deployment until years down the track. You know, I mean, questions obviously about the rail projects, for example, or mine expansions in that regard. Implementation risk, right? So you want projects that are a safe bet, that where you're sure that they'll actually happen, where you are reasonably sure that cost overruns won't be a large issue, that kind of thing. We would argue, compatibility with low carbon objectives. You would want where you can have environmental benefits at the local level, and conversely, you would want to avoid environmental damage at the local level. You want to reap social benefits, and there's many dimensions, of course, to this. The standout ones might be benefits to low-income households, but also regional benefits are, of course, very important in terms of a social dimension. You want to improve rather than degrade resilience to future shocks. including a possible resurgence of the pandemic, but also other types of external shocks. And you want to do all of this with a sound level of governance. And so you'll want to, at the margin, prefer projects where you can assure good public governance. On the basis of these criteria, and my colleagues will go into some detail as to how we work this through, on the basis of these criteria, roughly we identify 4 broad categories of investment options in Australia that would fulfill many of these criteria, not necessarily all of them. So the nature of a multi-criteria analysis like this is that you will inevitably need to make trade-offs between performance on different criteria. But what you're looking for is good performance across a range of criteria, or standout performance on some criteria without going too deep into the negative on most of the other criteria, right? That's the kind of spirit that you will take to this. And the ultimate decision taken, of course, is one of judgment, is one of not just sound policy evaluation, but politics, obviously, as well. But you want to be transparent about how these investment decisions relate to these criteria. So the 4 broad categories we've identified are renewable energy supply, including expansion of transmission investment. So an interesting aspect here are the renewable energy zones that the Australian Energy Market Operator has identified. New South Wales has probably in the most advanced stage of preparation for these. So essentially, we know the areas of the country where large-scale wind and solar facilities should be going in. Seems a fairly safe bet. Of course, there can always be surprises, but you would think that making large-scale investments there now, you wouldn't go wrong. The idea is, of course, that these would be private investments. However, there is the risk that if this present situation turns into a lasting deep recession, then that could also affect the preparedness of the private sector to invest at this point in time. There are signs that the enormous boom in renewables investment in Australia is tailing off. And so we argue that there is a clear opportunity at this point for state governments and potentially even the federal government to come in and facilitate the continuation of that kind of investment pipeline through contracts or even through direct government ownership, could be sold off later on, of renewable energy projects. Hand in hand with that goes transmission expansion to connect these to the grid. Secondly, and very importantly, energy efficiency in buildings. So these are the ready options that are available right now. They are, for a very large part, economically no-brainers because the energy savings pay back the initial investments quite quickly. And they can also have quite significant social benefits in terms of improving cost of living for low-income earners, in particular in public housing or in private housing among lower-income households, and improved amenity and improved fiscal balance down the track in terms of the retrofit of existing older public buildings, including, very importantly, schools, as well as hospitals and other buildings. So, of course, you'd think of pink bats in that regard, the Rudd government sort of signature policy on that. I would argue that it needs to be broader than just ceiling insulation, right? So you're talking all kinds of home insulation, you're talking double glazing, you're talking the replacement of old gas-based heating systems with electric heating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you also would not need to organize that as a government-run business, right? You could leave it entirely to the private sector, but with public subsidies and public contracting as far as public buildings go. Of course, this could be an issue equally for state governments and territory governments as well as feds. Okay. Thirdly, selected transport projects, and we're selected because we'll come to that in a minute. The infrastructure project pipeline is really dominated by transport projects. Some of them will not be able to get off the ground quickly. Some are quite ready to implementation. Those are the ones we'd be looking at accelerating implementation and perhaps increasing the scale at which you invest early on. Transport infrastructure projects can also be really small scale, right? And they can be active transport, it can be walkways, there can be bike paths, right? And these are the kinds of things that can be done very locally, thus giving a very direct support to the local construction industry, and it can be done very quickly because planning processes usually are minimal. And finally, land management and ecological restoration. Post bushfires, there's actually an enhanced need, an even greater need than normally, for positive measures to improve the local ecology in many areas of the country. And that's an obvious opportunity for fiscal expenditure in the region outside of the capital cities, but also not in remote regions where fly in, fly out situation. And oftentimes these will be job opportunities in communities that are economically and socially already relatively weak, and that oftentimes are also hit by the tremendous decrease in travel and tourism that we've seen. So they seem very attractive options to scale these up. I won't dwell on the detail, just to refer you to the paper. We've really provided a fair bit of initial thinking on the various ups and downs of these project categories. And at this point, I would like to hand over to Ziba Anjum to tell us a little more about the review and synthesis that we've done for this paper.
Thanks, Frank. I will be talking about the 10 studies and proposals that we have assessed for developing our own evaluation criteria. I'll also be talking about some key features of these proposals. Now, these proposals have been put forth by several organizations and think tanks, and several of them call for integration of low carbon objectives into stimulus package design. We've also evaluated a couple of studies that came up with an evaluation criteria for assessing stimulus packages announced under the global financial crisis in 2008. So on our next slide, we have listed the stimulus proposal studies that we've assessed, as well as a list of evaluation criteria on the diet that they've considered. So amongst them, the first one amongst them is the World Bank study, which they proposed release a checklist for assessment of economic recovery interventions. It is the most comprehensive of all studies that we've evaluated and consider most criterion listed on the right. Climate and social policy experts from academia and civil society have also released a set of guiding principles for stimulus spending called the Green Stimulus Proposal. Their focus is job creation, targeting stimulus towards affected communities, as well as a focus on decarbonization. The Australia Institute has published a list of design principles for effective economic intervention. They've evaluated a range of stimulus projects using a multi-criteria analysis framework. They've emphasized on timeliness, job creation, targeting stimulus towards affected sectors, as well as focusing on projects that target domestic production. Climate Action Tracker has also called for a green stimulus proposal. The evaluation is on similar lines as the World Bank study. The Center for American Progress, which is an independent public policy think tank, has released guiding principles for infrastructure investment under stimulus spending. They've recommended long-term infrastructure investment in traditional sectors with a focus on repair projects, and they've also highlighted the need for focusing on sustainable infrastructure programs that involve decarbonization. New Zealand's Climate Change Commission has also suggested guiding principles for aligning economic recovery with climate goals. They have called for bringing forward future transformational climate change investments that can deliver long-term growth. In Australia, two sub-level governments have released, of New South Wales and Victoria, have released a project evaluation criteria that will be used for planning and development applications. Their criteria is similar to other studies, but one thing that stood out was governance as a distinct component of the criteria. The objective is to ensure transparent project selection and assessment, as well as probity and integrity of development and planning applications. Amongst the two studies that we've looked at that proposed an evaluation criteria for global financial crisis stimulus proposals is the Bauer et al. Paper. They've developed a comprehensive multi-criteria for assessing green proposals that are a part of fiscal stimulus spending. as well as the OECD, which proposed guidelines for the design and implementation of stimulus packages. So to get a sense of how individual project categories in infrastructure would fare on such an evaluation criteria, we looked at evaluations made of the likely performance of infrastructure investment options during the global financial crisis. So on our next slide it's a snapshot from our paper. And so, which basically compares two studies that actually apply an evaluation criteria for project categories in infrastructure, such as afforestation and ecosystem restoration programs, energy efficiency upgrades, renewable energy, public transport projects, power grid expansion projects, as well as recycling systems. Now, this is on the lines of a traffic light system where green is good and red is considered bad. A number of project categories, a number of projects have been assessed under these project categories. And what emerges from this sort of assessment is that projects under afforestation and ecosystem restoration programs, energy efficiency upgrades, and renewable energy are the ones that most closely align with green stimulus objectives, whereas project categories of public transport, power grid expansion projects, and recycling systems would be more context and project specific. So I'll now transfer it to Tom to talk about our assessment of projects for Australia.
Hi, so I'm Tom Longden, as Frank said, economist here at Crawford School. I'll be talking to you about some of the practical project options that we looked at, and also starting with an introduction to some of the materials from Infrastructure Australia and the Australia-New Zealand infrastructure pipeline. So the projects on the Australian Infrastructure Australia priority list are shown there. Most of them are transport projects, as Frank said. There are some very interesting projects on the list. One of the ones I wanted to highlight here is the National Remote Housing Condition Priority Initiative. The interesting thing about the Infrastructure Australia list is that they have priority projects and priority initiatives. Projects are those with a developed business case, and initiatives are those that are project ideas that have not developed a project business case as of yet. And Infrastructure Australia sometimes uses project initiatives as a way of bringing projects forward and proposing them as being important. Down below, you can see the Australia-New Zealand infrastructure pipeline. Again, most of the projects are transport projects, and the Second Bass Strait Interconnector is one of these mentioned. So the Infrastructure Australia priority list, there's two transport examples that I thought I'd just show you. These are just giving you an example of how you can actually look at the different project assessments on those lists. These two examples are transport infrastructure projects that are very close to being ready to start. And basically they're either at the process of having the tender announced or actually are in the planning stages and almost ready to go ahead and be implemented. On the Australia-New Zealand infrastructure pipeline, there's the ACT Light Rail Stage 2A, and there you can see that they have the information provided based on where they are in the pipeline, the status. So this status here is now under procurement, with construction being planned to start in mid-2020. And hence these three projects are important projects that need to go ahead and potentially, if they can be, fast-tracked as well. So these are the four project types that we really focused on in the conversation article. Frank introduced them before. I really wanted to talk about two examples. So energy efficiency programs and improvements to public housing and buildings. We saw this as an important project type because of low carbon objectives. If there's energy efficiency, replacement of gas heaters for electric heating and rooftop solar involved, that corresponds with low carbon objectives. There's high potential for positive employment impacts, and that happens across the country and for support small and medium businesses. The economic case is strong because there's future savings from reduced energy costs in the future. and that will help the fiscal positions of federal, state and local governments. Social benefits will arise, especially in public housing and low income earners, and timeliness tends to be quite excellent. And I've provided 2 example projects there where you've got projects that are already up and running that could be expanded. In the case of the Clean Energy School Initiative, the Queensland Government has already brought forward solar installations on public schools that were planned for 2021 for late 2020. The Victorian Government's Healthy Homes and also energy upgrades for high-rise public housing are programs that exist and that had to be halted because of social distancing, but could be rolled out further. In the case of Healthy Homes, they started with the Goulburn Valley and West Melbourne, but there are other potential candidates. Also, just to touch on Frank's point about public transport infrastructure and active travel. So in this case, we say that the assessment's highly dependent on the particular project context. Timeliness will depend on what stage of the pipeline they are at. The employment effects will be quite strong, and bear in mind that we want different employment effects. So larger transport projects will have broader employment, but also smaller projects such as building and refurbishing footpaths and cycle paths will employ people in labour positions, so they can actually employ a lot of people who have recently lost jobs. Low carbon objectives there again, especially in case of reduced passenger vehicle traffic, and social benefits will arise from walking and cycling infrastructure because of those health benefits. So there's 2 example projects. One of them is on the Infrastructure Australia list as a priority initiative, and there's also existing ACT government programs. So just to finish up, what I really wanted to do was encourage you to look at the working paper. The conversation article has the boxes that we showed before, but the working paper has these tables with a lot more detail on what we assessed different project categories as. So in this case, you've got the renewable energy zones, and the example there is this statement for employment that they will increase employment in rural areas. And timeliness will occur if the pilots can be fast-tracked and construction can happen sooner than later. And of course, governance, AEMO has done assessments of solar and wind quality, which is important. Here you've got the larger improvements to public housing, schools and other buildings. There you can see our assessments for those. Again, a lot of positives if they can be implemented quickly. And in this case, we've given a lot of examples of existing programs that could either be replicated or expanded. And there's a lot of potential there in those project examples. And to finish up, just a quick comment that we do have land management, afforestation and improving parklands, wetlands and other ecosystems on the list. The ACT government is an example where they have employed people to do some land management in response to the bushfires. And that was targeted at people who had recently lost their jobs from COVID impacts. So I'll hand it back to Frank to start the Q&A. Here's our website, but of course we'll share materials in the Q&A and the comments as well. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, excellent. That's great. And just to note, we are recording this webinar. So if you'd prefer for your intervention not to be recorded, then just let us know and we'll pause the recording. So we have the opportunity to give the floor to individual participants. So the first question that came in is a question on gas by Reese, I'm sorry, pronunciation Thomas. So I'd be happy to give you the floor, Reese, if that works. I'll do that now. Is that working for you? Would you like to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go right ahead.
So yeah, my question was just about whether you view gas as a part of the low carbon transition or if you view gas as a carbon intensive system, and what your thoughts are on that. Because I've heard.
Yeah, so yeah, a super important question in particular in that very evident push at the federal level for expansion of Australian gas production, including, you know, what has been heard from the COVID Commission so far, what's reflected in the discussion paper for the technology roadmap and other areas. And so, look, right now the fact is that gas plays a relatively important part in Australia's domestic energy system as a balancing fuel, largely in electricity supply, okay, as a source of high temperature heat in various industrial processes, and obviously to some small extent, but still important for domestic heating as well as cooking, okay? So we're not getting away from that really quickly. If you look at South Australia, then you know you've got around about 60% renewable energy supply there on average, and the rest is gas. Okay, so one vision is that this is kind of the future for the Australian grid, right? With an ever larger renewable energy share, and the rest largely taken up by gas. Certainly, the chief scientist is of the view that we're heading that way. But the point is that gas is actually a lot more expensive than renewable energy plus storage in a system where you're building new assets, right? And so any of these analyses that contrast a system that is based around renewables plus storage, so pumped hydro plus battery in their various configurations, right? Plus potentially hydrogen electrolyzers and then feeding the hydrogen back into the electricity system. There's different configurations of that. Most of these analyses show that in the longer term, your renewable energy system plus storage is actually cheaper than using gas, right? And on the basis of that, you would expect that you see a diminishing role for gas, okay? Depends, of course, on the gas price, and that's where the international dimension comes in. When you zoom out the big picture, right, there are many better places in the world to use a limited amount of gas that might be combusted in the future, right? Namely, places with much higher population densities and places where the production of renewable energy is problematic, in particular because of population density, because of availability of renewable energy supply, and in the higher latitudes because of the problem in the winter months, right? And so really in a world that's decarbonizing, you see gas used for a lot longer in Northeast Asia and in Northern Europe and perhaps the north of the Americas than in Australia. So that would be roughly my answer to that, right? We'll probably see a diminishing role of gas. And as a result of that, now we're probably coming to the pointy end of this very convoluted answer, is I would not assess stimulus infrastructure investment in gas infrastructure, okay, as an option that is in line with longer term economic objectives. It is self-evidently not in line with longer term low carbon objectives, because in order to fulfill the balancing role that gas might play in a renewable system, we've got all the infrastructure we might need for that, really. And you know, expanding gas supply and transport infrastructure really has a question mark over it in terms of its viability in a world that moves away from high carbon systems. Okay, I'm sure that will provoke some responses. So please just give us an indication either on the Q&A or on the chat, and we'll give you the floor. If not, I'll quickly go through the Q&A questions that are there. Kirsten Anker is asking, have we been in contact with the National COVID Coordination Commission? Are they aware of your work? I don't know. We've, well, you know, we've done our normal outreach, but So that's still in progress. As always with these things, it's a matter of providing some public visibility for the work. But yeah, absolutely crucial, obviously, the work of the National COVID Coordination Commission, as well as, of course, the ongoing work of Infrastructure Australia in terms of evaluating different infrastructure investment options and priorities. We've got a question from Reza Fazili on multi-criteria analysis, and perhaps Reza would like to come in at this point. If you like, I'll press on the allow to talk button. So it's just your option if you'd like to come in here.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, great.
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. So you have this a very comprehensive list of criteria, and I was curious to know if you have this plan to look into the trade-offs between these criteria, which is needed for prioritizing the investment projects, and how you are going to tackle that issue. Thank you.
Yeah, Tom or Zeba, would you like to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I can speak to that, because I think when we developed the criteria in mind, we really were thinking about improving transparency around announcements. So when a stimulus package will be developed, we imagine a government will take a portfolio approach, and there'll be trade-offs between different projects and why they may be high in one area and low in the other. And so even at this time, we expect that some projects will be selected because they'll be very high in employment in rural areas or have greater social benefit. And so so for us, we haven't been ranking the projects. We believe that's a role for somebody else, but we really do want to improve the transparency on project selection and also project design. And that was one of the key things that we had in mind when we were developing these criteria. Zeba, did you have anything to comment?
Yes, I would just like to add that this, we would be able to assess the trade-offs if we had more information about these projects, because it would also depend on individual project assessments.
Okay. Cameron Curry asked a question about reasons for why constraining it to stimulus packages. Cameron, would you like to expand on that question / comment?
Yes, I'm happy to.
Great.
So I was just wondering why it seems reactionary, I guess, in my thinking for it to just be stimulus packages. And I guess if you rush to try and implement something with these stimulus packages, there could be a disbenefit in some of the proving of the process may not come to fruition, I guess.
Yeah, so yeah, very important point. I mean, in terms of actually, look, what we're talking about is really good principles for public investments, right? The economic benefits, social benefits, environmental benefits, orienting it towards low carbon, right? And that's really a kind of thing that one would want to see reflected, for example, in the national long-term low emissions strategy that we understand will be under development. And so we're really in this particular piece of work, we're just talking about that very specific issue as to how might one want to go about assessing options for COVID stimulus related infrastructure investment, right? Just simply because it is very obviously an issue that is on many governments' table right now, right? So perhaps for a little bit of international context, the European Union proposed stimulus package has a very large element of so-called, future type investments, renewable energy, electric mobility, better communication infrastructure, improvements to housing, et cetera, et cetera. The German stimulus spending package, as announced, I think from memory, it's about 130 billion euros, so around about 200 billion Australian. About 1/4 to 1/3 of that is slated for these kinds of low carbon proof type investments, and so it's that kind of conversation that we're trying to advance with this work. But I think, if I understand right, your point that really these kinds of things need to be incorporated into all business decisions and really all government investment decisions, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, Frank, if I can jump in there, I think it's important to point out that the discussion about this criteria really came from started with a discussion of the Infrastructure Australia priority list. And really, we thought that it would be fantastic to be able to get more information on those lists. And you saw the example at the moment. There are some very important details listed for those priority projects. But I think the concept of this research really came about, wouldn't it be great to see that with, say, 9 indicators that have a high, medium, low ranking, so you can really understand exactly why one project is high priority versus priority. And that's true of the Australian lists. So the New South Wales government and Victorian government do have a criteria for their stimulus projects, but they don't actually evaluate the projects, or at least reveal how they evaluated the projects against the ones announced. So again, it would be wonderful to be able to see, you know, those assessments. And even if it's just the top 3 or 4 reasons why a project was high priority versus priority, or, you know, some projects were just not prioritized.
Yeah, so on the Q&A, I see Louis Wishart is asking about, and please do let us know if you'd like the floor as well. Just briefly keep things moving. Emissions from gas. There's also emissions in the production process rather than just burning it. Yes, absolutely. And in fact, yeah, I mean, roughly speaking, deriving a unit of energy from gas compared to deriving a unit of energy from coal gives you about half the greenhouse gas, the carbon dioxide emissions in combustion. But to that, you need to add the greenhouse gas emissions from production of the 2 fossil fuels, or extraction of the 2 fossil fuels. And typically emissions from gas production are higher than from the other fossil fuels, right? Especially because, you know, you tend to have methane leaks, and methane is a very important greenhouse gas. And yeah, I mean, the scientific literature in fact suggests that the fugitive emissions from gas extraction the world over, or I should say in aggregate in the world, are probably severely underestimated in the official accounting or estimations compared to what we can actually measure in the atmosphere, right? It's not surprising because it's actually very difficult to measure and monitor these things. And the people who are in the best position to measure and monitor are the operators of the plants, whose incentives are not to report high levels of fugitive emissions, okay? So in terms of Australia's emissions inventory, the expansion of the LNG industry has been the single biggest source of increasing emissions over the last few years. And so any expansion of the gas export industry does, of course, have that effect of also increasing domestic greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah. I'd like to give the floor to our colleague and collaborator, Professor John Wiseman, from who's at University of Melbourne. I'll just need to find the right button, and then we'll come to you in a second. Here we go, John.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks, Frank and Tom and Zeba, for that really interesting paper and presentation. I have 2 brief questions. One is about priorities, and it's the question about how these infrastructure investment priorities should sit alongside and relate to proposals for investment in service industries such as health and education, how you would see the infrastructure proposals relating to the health and education investment possibilities. And my second question is a strategic one, really. It's about noting that there are many players, many proposals out there at the moment, and a range of opinions. I guess my question is, what do you see as the priorities for creating the strategic alliances with institutions and organisations that are likely to really maximise support for turning these investment proposals into reality?
Yeah, excellent. And I'll throw to Tom and/or Zeba in a moment in terms of our findings from the review of prior experience in the GFC and also proposals that are out there. But yeah, once again, I mean, you know, fiscal stimulus spending is a lot more than just infrastructure investment, very obviously, right? And the bulk, in fact, of spending in Australia and elsewhere has gone on just simply, you know, wage support and business support. And that business support will then obviously also go to some extent to rekindling activity in the services sectors, right? I think ultimately the answer there is in how the structure of the economy develops, and we've seen over time in Australia an increase in the share of the services sector and an increase in the share of the resources sector and a decrease in the share of the manufacturing sector. And so, you know, to the extent that a recession like this might change the trajectory of economic growth, I think a clear direction to take is that, you know, a further expansion of the services sector, in particular in high value added services such as education, banking, consultancy, some aspects of tourism, is surely in the national interest long term, also in terms of resilience of economic growth to external shocks. But yeah, Tom, Zeba, on those issues before we get to the strategic alignment issues.
I was just going to chip in. The interesting thing, I think, for us was we started with a focus on infrastructure projects, but then as soon as we developed the criteria based on the examples, programs had to come into play in a big way, especially some of those land care and energy efficiency programs. So definitely the balance in the articles that we have are trying to balance that discussion between infrastructure projects and social programs and other support programs. And definitely the criteria that we've developed is broad. And so I think it can be widely applied. And of course, timeliness and employment are cases where many programs may be more timely and actually focus a lot more on direct employment of people who have lost jobs, who may not have the skills for large infrastructure projects, but are willing to get out there and you know, work in areas that they normally wouldn't work on. The ACT government example I gave was an interesting one where they directed, instead of asking for volunteers to do environmental programs, they actually employed a few people and trained them up very quickly to actually participate in those programs. So that's very timely and had a big direct impact on employment in the region.
Zeba, anything else from the work you've done for the paper?
Yep. So one of the focus that we've had is to sort of look at the differences between valuations done for the global financial crisis stimulus, because there's different sectors of the economy that are affected because of COVID-19 restrictions. So there's the group of people working in front-facing roles are more affected than others, and they might not be suitable for construction jobs. So we, under the list of projects that we've evaluated, we've also factored in projects that could be widely, that a lot of unskilled people could widely be enrolled in. That's another focus that we've had in developing the list of projects, which is why the focus has sort of shifted from infrastructure projects to programs as well.
Yeah. So John, you also asked about, you know, essentially coalition of organizations or, you know, working together to advance these kinds of sound principles. And I guess, I just observed that a number of organizations in the Australian ecosystem have already put out their various takes on this. I mean, what come to mind, and this is very, incomplete list. The Australia Institute has something out there. I'm aware of some. ACF, the various business associations, of course, have made their views known, and so that's the normal kind of, I guess, marketplace of public policy ideas. That's good. The question to an extent is, what are we doing at the federal level as well as the state level to create a sounder set of institutions, right, that evaluate these things and others, in particular in the low carbon transition space, that evaluate these things in a timely and transparent manner, right? So we already have, of course, institutions federally, right? We have the COVID Commission that was mentioned earlier on. Personally, I'm not, I haven't heard too much come out of that commission publicly, other than a leaked reports about a leaked draft report, right? So that seems to be limited so far in terms of what actually comes from that institution officially into the public domain. There is the Climate Change Authority, right? And so it's an interesting question whether we will see an intervention from the Climate Change Authority on the issue of COVID recovery and how that relates to emissions futures. I think that's potentially really important to see how that statutory authority relates to that. There is Infrastructure Australia, who provide priority assessments of infrastructure, and I'm not at this point aware in detail of the mandate and what that institution might do on that particular issue. But then there's also a question: what do states and territories do, right? So Victoria and New South Wales have come out with these criteria and announced various COVID recovery projects, right? There's not too much in terms of a forum where there's clarity, transparency, and replicable analysis of what to choose and on what basis to make those choices. And the big question is, of course, what if this isn't a quick recovery, but if that's an economic slowdown or downturn that continues through time, which could unfortunately very well be the case if this turns into a lasting global recession, right? So I don't want to paint too negative a picture on this, but I think we need to be prepared for that possibility, and as part of that, it seems a sensible thing to actually make some forward planning as to contingency options for public investments. Okay. Yeah, I think that might be a good time to draw our little webinar to a close. Really, thank you very much for joining us. And we're always happy to receive direct feedback, on our work, on ideas, on specific comments also on this paper that we will be revising. And also to the extent that you are in Canberra or occasionally in Canberra, we very much look forward to, at some point in time, be welcoming you back in person once again to ANU. I'm certainly very much looking forward to that day. With that, goodbye. Thank you very much, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.